Good afternoon, and it gives me huge pleasure to introduce Nick Shaler, Sir Nick Shaler, to you, who's going to give the Bugatti lecture. When Ford bought Jaguar, the company I was chairman of, they looked for their brightest young man to run it, and they brought in Nick to do that job. And he was promoted from there to run Europe, and then the world. By the way, it's quite unearthly when you ring up his office, or his ex-office in Dearborn, because the telephone operator says, "Hello, this is world headquarters." And I have to say, the first time I did that, I said, "Gosh, it's very reassuring to know somebody's running the world." But anyway, for a while, Nick was indeed running the world. It is a wonderfully distinguished career that Nick has had, and it's an inspiration to all of us. But I said it was a pleasure to introduce him. It is because he's a thoroughly nice man as well. Sir Nick Shaler.
Well, thank you very much, John, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know if I deserve any kind words from John, but I thank him nonetheless, because he could have said much, much worse and very different words. My talk today is about the past, the present, and a view of the future of the automotive industry in the UK. And I think particularly in this city, you've got to start with the past in 1896. Because in 1896, in this city, was produced the first passenger car in Great Britain. Now, some will dispute and say, well, Charles Lanchester actually built one first, but it was the first car for sale, let us say. And it was a Daimler, and it was produced here, and it went on to be the Daimler Mark, which was subsequently purchased by Sir William Lyons and became part of Jaguar. But why was Coventry chosen for the first car? And more importantly, perhaps, why did so many car manufacturers make Coventry their base in the 1900s, the 10s, the 20s, the 30s, and right the way through? And why today is only one left? Well, Coventry was chosen because Coventry had the necessary skills. Coventry had been, from the 18th century onward, a home of clockmaking and then watch manufacturing. And that requires, as you know, a lot of skills in gears, in turning, in fitting fine things together, doing them accurately and making sure that the time is accurate. That had then transferred those skills to cycle manufacturing in the late 19th century. And so when the car industry was nascent, it was natural to come to Coventry because here lay skills in metalworking, skills in shaping, skills in assembly, and skills in how to treat metals. So many, many companies established themselves in Coventry, and Coventry became the center of car manufacture. Now, other parts of the UK also had automotive manufacturing. Most notably, I think we think of Longbridge and Cowley. Respectively, Austin and Morris. And they were built around Longbridge and Cowley because the owners, the founders, Austin and Morris respectively, lived around there. And much like Henry Ford in Dearborn, Michigan, didn't want to move home. They wanted to stay where they were and comfortably build up their empires, and they were empires. And Cowley and Longbridge became the home of mass production, I would say, in the UK. But Coventry was nonetheless hugely, hugely important. Let's move fast forward, because history would be boring if we went into every minute detail, and let's move to post-World War II. During World War II, and indeed during World War I, the car industry had played an enormous part in the war effort and was damaged, particularly here in Coventry, very, very severely. But after World War II, the car industry had a very important role to play in the future of the UK. The UK was, not to put too fine a point on it, bust. If we think we're broke today, we were really broke then. And the only way that the government could see of changing that situation was to go for exports. And steel was then rationed, along with foods and lots of other things in the UK, but steel was rationed. And as a car manufacturer, you would only get an allocation of steel if you would guarantee to export. And so there was huge domestic demand. But the prime thrust was to export. And export the UK did. It exported to the Empire. It exported to Europe. It exported to the US. And there were ready buyers. Because at that time, post-World War II, the UK was the second largest manufacturer of passenger cars in the world. Germany had not recovered. Japan had not recovered. France had never really recovered. It did in the mid-50s, but at this stage that I'm talking about, there was not very much there. Italy was still problematic, and Spain had no industry whatsoever. So it was the US and the UK. And the UK did amass buyers, as I say, all over the world. Now, unfortunately, those buyers bought the cars without really checking out what lay underneath the bonnet. And the quality of the vehicles was not really of very, very good levels. And that quality was to become an albatross around the British automotive industry's neck going forward. And another albatross, as we moved down from the 50s into the 60s, was the tendency of governments to continually change the taxes from horsepower to literage to various other ways of taking money out of the car owner. And taxes became a real problem because when it was a horsepower tax or then an engine-sized tax, that drove manufacturers to produce certain sizes of vehicles for the UK, and that then drove those vehicles to be exported. And frankly, that was not good for the future of the automotive industry, as we'll see later on. There were, however, two other critical issues that impacted the auto industry in the years after World War II. And if we move now into the 60s, the auto industry wanted to expand. And specifically, people who had designs on expansion, new factories, were Ford in Dagenham. They wanted to expand in the southeast. Vauxhall in Luton, they wanted to expand close to their home as well. Roots here in Coventry wanted to expand. And British Leyland, the truck manufacturers, or I should say Leyland as they were known in those days, together with BMC, also wanted to put up new truck factories. And the government decided that expansion was good, but expansion would only be permitted if the companies did it on the government terms. And they edicted areas where manufacturers could build plants. So Ford and Vauxhall were forced to Liverpool. Roots was forced to Scotland, as were Leyland and BMC for trucks. These were areas of high unemployment. Social changes, societal changes were happening, and the auto industry brought a lot of employment with it. But the companies were forced to build new factories far, far away from their home bases. Forced to move there, managers and foremen who really didn't want to move. I can remember in Ford, where I started in 1966, nobody really wanted to move from deepest Essex, Dagenham, I mean, a beloved part of the world, I'm sure you would say. It is the part of the world where I grew up, by the way, so I can say that with some degree of knowledge. Nobody from Essex wanted to go to this horrible place called Merseyside, where they didn't even talk proper, and they didn't know which football teams to support. West Ham was an enemy back on the Mersey in those days, and I'm sure at Vauxhall and Luton the same was true, let alone moving from Coventry to godforsaken Scotland, just near Glasgow, for roots. All of those plants became nightmares, but they were nightmares originated by government policy. And it was a huge governmental mistake, a huge strategic error to think that Whitehall should take plant location decisions for the auto industry and that would be successful for the car companies. Needless to say, you all know the history of what happened. All the plants in Scotland closed. Halewood and Ellesmere Port were quite frankly a nightmare for years. Now, I must say that Halewood turned itself around and is now producing some of the finest quality vehicles in the world for Jaguar Land Rover. And clearly, General Motors' decision to invest in Ellesmere Port and by implication close Bochum in Germany, that is another important indicator that Ellesmere Port also has become a very, very high quality, successful plant. But it took more than 50 years. What a waste. I said two major strategic errors driven by government. Excuse me. The second was perhaps even worse, and it's one that John Egan knows well. He was involved with it, and he has far better testimony than I, but let me try, with a layman's view, say what my perception of what happened. Morris and Austin had merged. They became BMC. That never really did anything, because you were still either a Morris or an Austin guy, and the two scarcely talked to each other, to such an extent that BMC had to recruit its management team from Ford, and they recruited John Barber. All the finance guys came from Ford, and they were recruiting product planners, trying to get to grips with a very unwieldy product situation, trying to commonize engines, transmissions, rear axles. It never happened. A Morris continued to be a Morris, and an Austin continued to be a Morris, with the salient exception, of course, of the Mini, driven by one man's vision of what could be, Alex Issigonis. So BMC was there, and it was a declining force in global markets. When I joined Ford in '66, BMC and what became British Leyland, Jaguar, Triumph, Standard, Rover, the share that they had of the British car industry was over 60%. By the mid-70s, that had declined 20 percentage points, a huge drop when you fight for every last tenth of a point of market share in the automotive industry. And it wasn't just BMC. Standard, Triumph were losing share. Lots of people were losing share, and the winners were Ford, pretty largely, and to some extent, Vauxhall. But there was a potential champion on the horizon, Leyland Trucks, run by a man called Donald Stokes, who'd been very, very successful in putting British trucks all over the world, including into Cuba and notably into Asia and Africa. And Leyland got curious as to what the car industry was as opposed to the truck industry. And they bought, first of all, into Standard Triumph, and then the government had a brainwave. Why not put it all together and create a homegrown champion for the automotive industry that could truly compete across the globe? British Leyland. And that came together, and that probably was the death knell of the domestic automotive industry, because it was unwieldy, it was unresponsive, it had terrible labor relations, and I'm not even going to say, we had terrible labor relations in Ford as well, but at least they weren't as bad as Red Robbo and his cohorts here in the Midlands. British Leyland turned out to be an absolute disaster, and of course it was capped by the Turner Report in the 70s, which then led directly, or indirectly I should say, to the reprivatization of Jaguar under John Egan. And Jaguar owes its survival today to that action of taking it out of the Leviathan, which was British Leyland, making it independent again, using the pride of the workforce and the power of the brand on a global basis to expand Jaguar. It was a tremendously brave undertaking because, quite frankly, Jaguar could have got killed by Leyland. And there is the famous and not apocryphal story that Jaguar worked very, very hard to make sure that the Leyland V8, the one used in the Rover, could not fit under the bonnet of an upcoming Jaguar, merely to make sure that Leyland didn't get its ugly hands on Jaguar's proud, proud powertrain. Those two errors, strategic errors, really changed the nature of the future of the British automotive industry. And what it became was an industry dominated by foreign-owned companies. I was out of this country from 78 to 92. When I came back in 92, as John said, to Jaguar, I didn't recognize the country or the car industry. The car industry at that time, Ford was still here, Vauxhall was still here, a rump called Rover was surviving, owned by British Aircraft, BAE Systems, and really surviving with great difficulty. Jaguar, thriving, thanks to John. Land Rover, cursed by the ownership from BAE and really producing some pretty poor vehicles out of Solihull. And then, the people I think we can call the saviors of the British motor industry. Japanese, every last one of them. Honda, Nissan, and Toyota all had invested massively in the UK, building factories in Sunderland, Swindon, and just up the road in Derby. Now, why had they come here? Well, they'd come here because Britain was a member of the common market, the EU. They needed duty-free access to continental European markets to sell their products. But they didn't want to put their factories in countries where, frankly, they had no knowledge of the language. They didn't have any Japanese schools there. The links with Japan were very limited in Germany, in France, anywhere else in Europe come to that. But they did have people who spoke English. They had worked in the States, in the Japanese factories that had been established in the States. They came over here and started these factories. Now, again, they recruited, just like British Leyland, BMC, they recruited largely from Ford. But they recruited some smart people from Ford and made sure that they integrated into the Japanese system. And so many of the people who've run Leyland, and Toyota and Nissan, not Honda, in fact, came from Ford, and I had worked with them as colleagues over the years. But what the Japanese also did, very, very importantly, was they brought their component suppliers with them. The long, long-running tail of the downward spiral of British Leyland had really impacted the supply base in the UK, sadly. When I started in Ford, I started in purchasing. In 1966, I used to visit the West Midlands from Dagenham probably twice or three times a week to see suppliers up here and oftentimes to make sure that they produced our stuff instead of somebody else's stuff, because there were always strikes. There were nearly always problems. But the West Midlands was then a teeming mass of suppliers to the automotive industry. When I came back in '92, they'd almost all gone. And of the world-class companies that had been here, if you think about it today, just about one survives, GKN. Virtually everybody else is gone. I probably do some company a disservice, but I was trying to rack my brains to think of another. And frankly, I can't think of them. I guess Girling still survives. It does. And Lucas still survives in a form called TRW. But really, GKN is the only, that I can think of, publicly quoted company that is still a global giant in the automotive supply business. So we'd lost that supply base in the West Midlands. The Japanese companies had suppliers. They brought them with them from Japan. And they'd integrated them around their factories as they do in Japan. And they were highly successful. But the point is that we in the West Midlands that had been the founding father, if you will, of the British motor industry, had lost not just its OEs, but had largely lost its supply base as well. And the Japanese were going to take advantage of what Britain could offer, which was duty-free access to the EU. And they've done a stunning job at it. Because let's look at where we stand today. Near record levels of production of passenger cars in the UK last year. Just over 1.7 million. This year, depending what happens in the euro, early on in the year people thought it could reach 1.85. May not quite reach that now. But that's a near record level of all-time vehicle production in the UK. We've got 3 Japanese majors located in this country, all of whom have recently announced significant expansion plans. They believe that Britain is still a very good place to do business. And then we've got what I will classify, for the sake of argument, as the luxury and specialist business, probably led in volume terms, undoubtedly led in volume terms, by Jaguar Land Rover. And what a spectacular success Jaguar Land Rover has been. We've just seen their profits, incredible. When I arrived at Jaguar, the profit that was made last year in Jaguar Land Rover was bigger than the turnover that I inherited from John. That tells you something about where Jaguar Land Rover has gone in 20 years. And then we have the specialist companies. Aston Martin, Rolls-Royce, Bentley, Morgan. We still have Lotus, but these are niche companies by and large. The biggest in the luxury segment is clearly Jaguar Land Rover, which now is of great appeal to people all over the world. And then we have motor racing, an area that few people talk about. But F1, all but 4 F1 teams have their headquarters, their development, their workforce, and their home office here in the UK. Now that didn't come about by accident. Let's look at why that happened. For the same reason as Coventry became the center of so many car companies, F1 and much of the rest of motorsport has homed in on the UK, because in a golden triangle, we've got massively experienced engineers in all areas: aerodynamics, chassis, ride, handling, engine, everything, allied to very, very high quality, world-class, quick-reacting component suppliers. So you could say the component industry has been lost to the West Midlands, perhaps, not entirely, but maybe it's gravitated to what's called the Golden Triangle, stretching from just Weybridge up to Northampton and embracing Oxfordshire, Warwickshire, bits of Warwickshire, and over to Northampton. We make the engines for most of the F1 teams. We make the engines for most of the IndyCar teams. We make the engines for much of the American racing scene. We do the bodies, the monocoques. We do it because we have the skills, and the engineers. Just like Coventry, so we still have those skills, and I'll come back to what that means for the future. We have also a very, very significant base in manufacturing engines. We all know the engines that are made at Hams Hall for BMW, the 3 millionth of which was produced just this week. But did you know that Ford Motor Company in this country makes 1 in 3 of every engine used by Ford worldwide? Ford makes 2 million engines a year in the UK, at Dagenham and at Bridgend. And there's a new engine plant going up for Jaguar Land Rover at Wolverhampton. We do a very, very good job in engines. We are developing a supply base for those engines, and long may that continue to be the case. Because the real value add is not done at the assembly plant, it's in the supply base. And if we let that supply base stay offshore, we add cost, we add time, and we miss the value add that this country could so dearly do with. And I hope governments recognize this and take the appropriate steps to support the companies as they try to invest in this country. As I said, we're big in engines. We're also big in engineering. We have some of the largest automotive engineering centers in Europe, right here in the UK. Nissan has a very big center. Ford has a huge center down at Dunton in Essex. Jaguar Land Rover, just down the road, here at Whitley and over at Gaydon, has over 4,000 engineers, and it's growing, that number of engineers. Now, why is the UK the home of so many automotive engineers? Because we have universities that recognize the importance of automotive engineering and are actually training people to fill those roles. And chief amongst them is where we are today, Coventry University. Because it's critical that we have that skill base. Now, there are others. There's Hatfield. There are graduate universities. There are also other universities that teach engineering to very, very high levels, but it's not automotive engineering. And automotive engineering, even though I'm not an automotive engineer, my engineering friends always told me it's different from mechanical engineering. Now, I'm too stupid to understand why, but I trust them, and I believe that teaching automotive engineering is critical, because if you're teaching automotive engineering, you're also teaching people about the automotive industry, and you work closely with that automotive industry, and that is critical. And I would say it's one of the hallmarks of what has happened here at Coventry and in a different automotive area over at Warwick Manufacturing Group, because those have been 2 universities which from the very outset have worked intimately and very, very committedly with their industry partners. Many universities won't do that. Many academics think it's a little below them to deal with grubby fingernailed engineers and oily rags who really don't understand the intellectual challenge and the disciplines. I would submit that anybody who knows anything about compound fluid dynamics would say that a CFD engineer understands very, very well about theoretical skills and knows how to use abstruse, very abstruse theorems. So, today, we're big in a lot of areas. Big in production, big in engines, big in engineers, big in Formula One and motor racing in general. And it's because of this tertiary education link with industry, I would submit. We also have great designers. There are only 4 prime design schools in the world. 2 in the States, 2 in the UK. And the ones in the UK are Royal College of Art in London, and again, right here in Coventry. The graduates of those 2 schools are spread worldwide. We had dozens of them in Ford. literally, all over the globe. And I would often go into design studios from Germany to Australia to Brazil to the US, and somebody had come up to me and in a very obviously English accent, they'd say, "Nick, do you remember me? We met at so-and-so." And I obviously said, well, but we had dozens of them trained here in the city. Immensely important, because design, contrary to what was thought in the automotive industry as recently as 40 years ago, is critical in the purchase decision. 40 years ago, we talked of cost and practicality being the key purchase drivers. And then it was fuel economy, key purchase driver. And then it was safety. But we now understand far, far better what really drives people to buy this car rather than that car. Because they're all about the same quality today. There's no big gap in quality. They all do about the same things. Some are better, some are worse. They're clustered around the same pricing points, because you can't sell something for 20% more if it's not 20% better. What differentiates them is the styling, the interior and the exterior. And that has become the key purchasing motivator. And this country is turning out designers who recognize that, and those designers are spread around the world and working for companies, for bosses who recognize that design is critical. Nobody buys an ugly anything if they can buy a beautiful something. Do you really want to get into a car every day and drive it if it's ugly, it's boring, and it's painted in an horrible color? I think the answer is no. You also want an interior that is comfortable, is functional, and looks fantastic, and feels non-plasticky, and feels responsive to your touch, because it is your car. Isn't anybody else's. It's yours, or it might be the lady in your life's car, because ladies, in fact, determine over 65% of car purchases. A fact we should never, ever forget, because many men think that it's they who decide. Wrong. We did lots and lots of studies. Women may not say much in the showroom, and too many people, salespeople in the showroom, might ignore the woman. They do so at their peril. Don't ever forget, design has to appeal, but if you've got a choice, make sure it appeals to the women in your life. So, good situation now, coming from a somewhat rocky past, a past that was successful and then went through the shoals as things happened, and the British auto industry, domestic owned, kind of imploded on itself. But thanks to foreign investment, we are now back with a vengeance and have the opportunity to move forward. So what will that future be? What does it hold? Well, I don't believe that we can anticipate seeing a massive surge in volumes. I think volumes will stay at or around the same level as they are today in the foreseeable future. Now, why do I say that? The worldwide automotive industry has suffered from one huge, huge problem for the last 40 years. And that problem is called overcapacity. This year, globally, something like 70 million new vehicles will be sold. But there's capacity to build about 90 million. So that's an awful lot of spare capacity chasing a limited number of buyers. So I don't think we're going to see mammoth expansion. Now, there are new countries coming along who are getting into automotive. But at least in the early days, they will want those cars to be built in their countries for foreign exchange reasons, for control reasons, and for pride. Because in many senses, an automotive industry is very analogous to a flagship airline. Most countries, most governments like to beat their chests and say, we've got a flagship airline. They also like to say, we've got a flagship automotive industry. Because automotive employs a lot of people, employs a lot of skills, and it's also prestigious. So they don't want you to close down capacity. As we've seen just this last week, Marchioni at Fiat proposed that we should shrink capacity in Europe. Well, we know we should shrink capacity in Europe. He's talking largely of Germany, France, Spain, and Italy. Because the new plants are located in the former East or in Turkey. But he suggested that the EU Commission pay the costs of closing down these plants that he knows they need to close in Italy, France, Germany, and Spain, which was promptly knocked on the head. But it just shows you where people are coming from, because they want to duck under a cloud cover, if you will, a blanket of saying, well, it was those guys in Brussels who forced us to do that. It wasn't us. I mean, we love you, but, you know, they forced us to do it. So I don't think we're going to see much change here in volume. We're not going to see a change in the capacity, the overcapacity situation. So if we're not going to grow, what does the future hold? I believe that education and the use of technology, the practical application of technology, will be absolutely key drivers to the automotive industry's future in the UK. There's one other area I'd like to talk about before I get into education and technology, however, and that's an area of the automotive industry that we really often disregard, and it's retail. The car system of buying cars has remained essentially unchanged since the very early days. You go along to a dealer, you see what the dealer's got on the lot, you haggle. If you've got a car to trade, you haggle some more, and you come away from that feeling, well, I got a new car, but I don't feel very satisfied because I think that salesperson got the better of me. And then if anything goes wrong and the phone doesn't get answered, you feel even worse about the purchase, and buyer's remorse sets in, and we know where that leads to. The retail system, as I said, has remained essentially unchanged since the early days of the car industry. Now, I find that vaguely ludicrous. Everything else in retail has changed dramatically in the last 10 to 15 years, driven by and large by the internet. I buy things, and I'm sure all of you buy things on the internet that we would never previously have thought of buying. And do we really need to go and kick tires at the car dealer to know what car we want to buy? Well, most of the people who kick the tires only know that kicking the tires is what they can do. They don't know anything about the technology. They know about the looks, they know about the cost, they know about the miles per gallon, but kicking tires and opening and closing doors is a bit stupid, I would submit. So I think the retail segment needs to change. Now, we still do need to have franchise dealers for service, unquestionably. It's a big purchase, a car. You don't want to put it to some non-qualified individual to repair in the event that something happens, and it will. Cars will always have faults because they are very, very complex animals. They don't fail like your Microsoft program fails and calls for a reboot, but they do have other problems. So I think servicing will still be required, but why don't we look at changing the retail space? Now, we could lead on that in this country. Most countries in Europe, most countries in the globe, have very, very tightly written franchise agreements, largely written by the dealers themselves. We have franchise agreements in this country, but they're not as restrictive, they're not as biased. I believe that if the OEs worked with the retail motor industry, and it would have to be a cooperative effort, we could change the nature of the buying experience so that the customer actually could come out feeling that it was a win-win. Yes, we'd use the web. Yes, we'd use competitive offering. But we'd also use the power of individual one-on-one relationship to make sure that the customers feel good, because the whole motor industry, OEs, suppliers, retail franchise dealers, all rely on only one individual for revenue, a customer. And we risk leaving our customers behind if we don't grow with them as they move into new technology. So I believe the retail segment offers an area where we could lead. A second area, and it was talked about this morning, was we buy 5- and 7-seater SUVs to use once or twice a year. Ridiculous. Why don't we move to a system where you don't buy a single car, but you buy the use of a car? Much like Rolls-Royce don't sell jet engines. They sell power by the hour. Why can't I go ahead and buy the use of a car, a single-seater for daily commutes, a family vehicle if I'm going away, a sports car if I'm going to a high school reunion? Why don't I have that opportunity to trade it? By calling up or logging in on the internet, and the person who provides the vehicle for me, manufacturer or consortium of dealers or whatever, they then deliver the car I want for this particular day, week, or month, and they take the other one away. And my contract with them is not to buy a vehicle. It's essentially to rent the car seats, number, size that I want, because I should be the customer deciding what I want to put my money towards, not forced into buying something for the one-off a year, once every so often usage of a particular vehicle. Again, a big change at retail, but something that if we, OEs, and the retail trade work together, I think we could at least make some baby steps towards. Again, it's driven by customers. Again, it's an opportunity to give customers a different experience. So, I come back now to technology and education. That has driven us, as I hope I've demonstrated, into the situation we are today. But we've got a lot of areas where we can further enhance the capability. We shouldn't, as an industry, just be working with the tertiary education field. We should be working at secondary. How many kids are lost to the automotive industry because they think engineering and math are too hard, or it's too messy, or there are horror stories around this, that, or the other? We should be working, striving actively to work with teachers and pupils to show them what the automotive industry is today, what manufacturing industry is today. It's a declining proportion of UK GDP, but manufacturing is still very, very important to the UK. It is our single largest export industry, and we should never be ashamed of that, nor should we forget it. And I think industry has an obligation to work with the schools to encourage pupils to come and learn what opportunities there are and how they best go about utilizing those opportunities. We should also work actively as an industry to reintroduce, in large volumes, apprenticeships. We lost apprenticeships by and large in the 80s. Looking back on it, that was a pretty big mistake, because we lost skills. And too many employers now have to put newcomers through remedial skills training, remedial education, if you will, because they didn't get it at school and there were no apprenticeships to help them gain it further. There are other areas where we can really work hard. Down in Surrey, Gordon Murray. Gordon was the former designer at McLaren for F1 cars. Gordon has come up with a concept, and he's recently shown 3 prototypes. He called it, he showed it to me some 2 or 3 years ago, he called it a factory in a box. It's a totally different way of assembling, building a car. It takes about half the floor space and a fraction of the investment because he's cut out a number of processes. He tells you he's cut it from 7 to 5. I thought it was from about 8 to 4, but he's far more knowledgeable than I, so I'll take his word for it. He's also designed a super lightweight vehicle, which can be powered by a 500cc or 600cc engine. It's a vehicle which is modular and can be modified almost at will. Huge amounts of commonality. I think that type of creativity from somebody who has clearly got a stellar engineering reputation going back many, many years is something that we should make sure people look at and study. I'm convinced it's practical. I'm convinced that it could be a real contributor to British engineering and support capability. We'll probably never put the factory up in this country, but what a plus if we could develop it for application in Africa, in Asian countries, etc., etc., but powered by British intellectual property. Tremendous opportunity, and I think shows the way, as we saw with some of the presentations this morning, that there are many, many things that can be done because globally we're all beset by the same CO2 problems, the same road congestion problems, and the same legislative, or largely similar, legislative requirements. So going our own way is not really an option. And then we have, in what I called earlier, our luxury and specialist segments, we have some tremendous capability. It's called brands. Now, we all know the power of the Jaguar brand, the Aston Martin brand, and the Land Rover brand. They really are tremendously powerful brands on a global basis. And today's management owes that to the past. Not the immediate past, but they owe that to a long, long history of past polishes of those marks. But something very interesting happened about 15 years ago. And I can't remember exactly when it was, so forgive me if my timeline is somewhat out. 3 German manufacturers decided to get in to the uber luxury segment of the world. And I refer, of course, to Volkswagen with Rolls-Royce, to BMW with Bentley. I've got it round the wrong way. I apologize. To VW with Bentley, to BMW with Rolls-Royce, and, of course, to Mercedes with Maybach. I think the only good thing that can be said about Mercedes' decision to call it Maybach was they didn't call it the other potential alternative which they had available to them, which was call it Horsch. Now, you may not remember Horsch, but that was Hitler's favorite car. So they called it Maybach. These were all cars that were going to dominate the Uber segment of luxury cars around the globe, and they would all sell 10,000. Maybach's case, they thought it would sell 20,000 a year. So 40,000 in a segment which, quite frankly, had not existed in any significant numbers up till then. I think we all know what happened. Bentley has arguably redefined luxury interiors. Rolls-Royce has retained that stately look, and now it's shrunk the grille from its first truck-like grille when it first came back on the market made in Goodwood. I think it's a much better car. They're selling in record numbers all over the world. A tremendous job. Now, what happened to Maybach? Clang, it's disappeared, it's gone, because it didn't have that brand. It's a great car. Pretty ugly paint schemes, but I mean, that aside, and you could have got it repainted if you really wanted to. I thought they were pretty ugly anyway. But it didn't have a brand. Nobody outside students of German automotive history had ever heard of a Maybach. If they'd have called it Mercedes, I suspect it might have been a real success. If it had been a Mercedes T-Class or Y-Class or whatever, it maybe would have been a success. But it wasn't. Big failure. It tells you that we have some brands in this country which are tremendously, tremendously valuable. And we should polish those brands. We really should. We should be proud of them. Why shouldn't the Queen drive in a Bentley? Well, she should, because it's a British car. May have German ownership, but Jaguar's got Indian ownership. Before that, Ford ownership. The ownership doesn't matter. The association with the history is what counts. So I think those brands are something that we can build on into the future. Really, the automotive industry is a great industry. I was in it for 39 years until I retired. It just is the most exhilarating industry to work for, and you work with great people. You really, really do. Some of the most creative, some of the most intelligent, and some of the most hard-working people you could find. But you also work for customers, discerning customers across the world, because the customer can go anywhere. And if the customer's going to come to you, if the customer's going to come to the UK, we have got to stress what we are good at. And I believe the future will go to those who stress innovation, applied technology in the service of what the customer needs, a customer focus from start to finish, and doing things that the customer can relate to, respond to, and recognizes are different, and keeping our brands polished. If we keep our brands polished, our education system integrated with industry, if we can do all the other things, I think the industry is set for a very bright future indeed. And I, for one, should cheer. The automotive industry gave me an awful lot. It really did. It gave me the opportunity to work around the globe. It gave me the opportunity for tremendous personal satisfaction and enjoyment. And above all, it gave me great cars to drive. Thank you very much.